here we meet to honor a site where Americans killed Americans. We gather shoulder to shoulder to remember, simply because we cannot and we must not forget. For what they lost enabled us to be the nation we are. Fascination with the Civil War continues even after 150 years. People around the world marvel at us, the way we continue to remember our past. Indeed, I would humbly suggest that history may be the one thing that holds us all together, is our common past. But we can't forget the war. The war was too big, it was too bloody, too all-consuming, too influential in the development of the Republic to be just another stepping stone in our history. By the end of the 1850s, Civil War was inevitable. The Cotton Kingdom of the South and the Industrial Revolution of the North had created two totally different societies. Changes in the North were occurring daily, with hundreds of thousands of immigrants bringing new ways and new strength to the industrial growth. In contrast, Southern society was static. Immigrants simply could not compete with slave labor. In the years of posterity, a rising sectionalism intruded upon fledgling people seeking nationhood. And soon the factory and the farm were competing for the same dollar. The ever-glaring presence of slavery in a land that boasted of freedom became more and more incendiary. By mid-century, the anti-slavery movement had infected American economics, society, and most dangerously, politics. Polarization replaced compromise, and the raging winds of the late 1850s became the tornado that struck in 1861. By then, many Southern leaders felt their way of life to be fatally threatened. They wondered what they stood to gain by remaining in the Union. The simple act of secession would save Southern society, maintain white supremacy, protect Southern slave property, soothe local tensions, and end Northern meddling into Southern affairs. And so South Carolina led the exodus of states. Charleston-born federal judge John Pettigrew scoffed at what his native state had done. And he sneered, "South Carolina's too small to be a nation. It's too large to be an insane asylum. It won't work." And it didn't work. Nevertheless, 10 other states followed South Carolina's freedom movement. And a third of our nation became the Confederate States of America. The firing on Fort Sumter in April was no big deal in and of itself. A half-finished structure squatting at the mouth of Charleston Harbor, it was defended by 76 very frightened soldiers. The 34-hour Confederate bombardment was spectacular, but it was anticlimactic. It was the straw, Fort Sumter, that broke the camel's back, the last of a long succession of irritants that had produced a festering situation in which only a spark was needed to ignite a national bonfire, and Fort Sumter was that spark. Whenever you're teaching history, you can't teach Civil War history as you do international war history. It's different. In an international war, there's a blow, a big blow that starts it. I think we all can agree that on December 7th, 1941, the Japanese demonstrated that they did not like America, and we went to war. But the Civil War is different. They're little things that in and of themselves inconsequential, but they keep piling up. And I love to teach the period 1846 to 1861, to see these things accumulating along the way. Uncle Tom's Cabin, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, Bleeding Kansas, the Dred Scott decision, all piling up until you've got this great bonfire, and you just reach finally one more point, and that'll do it. And that is exactly what happened at Fort Sumter. Now, between North and South, once the war began, there was no room for compromise. And even if there had been, immense emotions were welling up in people all across the country. It was emotion without formality, without restraint. The guns at Fort Sumter unleashed a civil war of unimagined savagery and destruction. The long-held military strategy of seize the enemy's capital and the country will fall didn't apply here. Emotions were too out of control for a single city to be the keystone of war. In other words, this is not going to be a war of chess. It's got to be a war of checkers. The North's emotions were too out of control for it to be so limited. And yet, the North's premier force, the Army of the Potomac, would spend the entire war with one target in mind, Richmond. Now, most of us know, or we take pleasure in thinking we know, the basic facts that transpired. 4 years of fighting with thousands of engagements stretching from Vermont to Florida and Virginia to Arizona resulted in the bloodiest struggle in our annals. Two major issues underlay the whole war. One, were states to revolve around a union or were they sovereign entities with a national overseer? And two, was America to become literally a land of the free rather than a country in which white people continued to enslave black people? Now, these two matters of contention could not be settled by a brief, limited war. The struggle had to be all-engulfing because the goals of each side were all-engulfing. Thus, the world became witness to history's first total war in which the will of civilians behind the lines had to be crushed as completely as military efforts of soldiers in the field. Now, in every war, a commanding general has a bad day. Let's face it. The one exception would be Braxton Bragg. For Bragg, every day was a bad day. In 1863, a Richmond newspaper said of Bragg's Confederate forces in Tennessee, "An army of asses led by a lion is better than an army of lions led by an ass." And this was a Richmond paper talking about a Confederate general. Each of the leading generals in the Civil War stumbled badly on at least one occasion. Arguments will never cease over what Robert E. Lee should or should not have done at Gettysburg. It keeps Civil War roundtables alive. There might have been of Gettysburg. William T. Sherman could never forget his senseless attacks at Kennesaw Mountain. Ulysses Grant regretted for the rest of his life the fatal assault he made at Cold Harbor. And one of Lee's finest lieutenants, A.P. Hill, made an egregious mistake here at Bristoe Station. They called him Little Pal Hill because while he stood 5 feet 9 inches tall, an inch above natural height, he weighed only 145 pounds. He was an aggressive, hard-fighting general who inspired men by personal example. Hill, remember, had saved Stonewall Jackson from defeat in 1862 at Cedar Mountain. A month later, he had saved Lee's army from destruction at Antietam. Hill became indispensable to Lee and his army. Yet conditions changed sharply in 1863, and these conditions were not relative to military affairs. I've spent my entire career as sort of an outcast. I'm not a military historian. I don't get sexually aroused by tactics and strategy and shooting guns and bleeding, etc. Battles per se do not interest me as much as do the component parts of war, the human factors, the forgotten elements, most especially the emotions that come into play. These are the things that get me interested. One glaring oversight will serve as an example. Now, I don't imagine any of you have ever thought of this. Had not America possessed so many horses, there would have been no Civil War. Ever thought about it? Horses were the fundamental necessity of any military force of that day. An army could not move without them. More than 1.5 million of those animals died in the Civil War. 1.5 million died of overuse, abuse, gunshots, starvation, and disease. No statue appears for them on any battlefield, nor was a single one of these obedient creatures ever given a decent burial. They normally were left on the ground to rot. Personal health is likewise an ignored but significant ingredient in Civil War history. Just seems to me how a general feels is directly related to how well he performs. That makes common sense. Grant, for example, was on crutches at Shiloh. He had sprained his ankle in falling off a horse. Southern Corps Commander Richard Ewell, whom Mr. Covington mentioned, was never the same after losing a leg in the Second Manassas Campaign. Here at Bristoe Station in October 1863, we have two sick men. One is Robert E. Lee. Lee is battling a heart attack, suffered 7 months earlier, and he was doing it all alone because physicians knew of no beneficial treatment for any cardiac problem. Indeed, the field of cardiology did not exist at that time. And so Lee in the autumn of '63 was riding around here, not on Traveler, but in a carriage. He was still so weak and incapacitated from a massive coronary attack. A.P. Hill was likewise ailing. He unknowingly was in the first stage of nephritis, Bright's disease, a kidney failure. Now, one cannot explain away the Confederate disaster at Bristoe Station on the ill health of two generals. However, neither can one ignore the fact that these physical impairments greatly affected the effectiveness of both Lee and Hill. Others this weekend, of course, will tell you in detail the one-sided fight that took place. General George Meade's Union Army was withdrawing northward right along the Orange and Alexandria Railroad. Lee's forces were in slow pursuit. At Bristoe Station, wasting no time in reconnaissance, which was the major fault, Hill made an attack against what he thought was an isolated, disorganized portion of the Union Army. Instead, two assaulting Confederate brigades charged into what became an L-shaped Federal line of heavily entrenched soldiers. In every war, fear is the predominant emotion as men in a combat. And I've studied the common soldiers all my life. No matter what you say, they were scared to death when war began. You face death and you lose most of the other emotions. Quoting Civil War soldiers, this fear appeared in different ways: sweatiness, nervousness, a violent pounding in the heart, shaking hands with everyone around you as if you're telling everybody goodbye. Many soldiers, and I quote again, were afraid of, quote, losing control of my bowels in a battle, or else peeing in my pants. And then when they came out of battle, many of them would write home to their wives or even their sweethearts and tell them they did not let loose anything while the battle was going on. It was a sense of pride that they had made it through. On the one side was the feeling of fight and survival. The other side hoped for steadfastness and devotion to duty. At Bristoe Station, Confederates advanced into one of the deadliest traps of the entire war. 40 minutes of fighting cost Lee 1,400 men, killed, wounded, and captured. Captain James Graham of the 27th North Carolina recalled, "When we came within 40 yards of the railroad, the enemy arose and gave us a volley which cut down more than half the remainder of our regiment. I doubt if such carnage was ever known in the same short period." I too doubt that. The 27th North Carolina suffered 70% casualties. It had 36 officers going into this short fight. 33 were casualties. And later, when Hill attempted to explain to Lee what had happened, the commander uncharacteristically rudely interrupted him. Well, General," Lee said, "bury those poor men and let us say no more about it." Nevertheless, Bristoe Station had positive consequences. The Union Army fell back 40 miles into northern Virginia. This allowed Confederates to take control of half of the major north-south railroad, the O&A, that coursed through the Old Dominion. And large-scale fighting in the states would not resume again until the following spring. Bristoe Station may seem to be but an overlooked incident in the long struggle fought in and for our state. However, it marked the deaths, the broken dreams of some 2,000 soldiers, north and south. It brought grief and loss to those soldiers' mothers and fathers, wives and sweethearts, who were waiting anxiously at home for a loved one who is not going to be coming home. Most of them had never heard of Bristoe Station. Thereafter, most of them never forgot the name. It was a small engagement in the history books, but for those who lost their loved ones, it was life itself. And that is what brings us to this countryside today. To walk on the Bristoe battlefield is to make a journey back through time. We see ground, we're standing on it, consecrated by the blood of young men, north and south, who loved the same country. No one today should choose sides. That is un-American. The mutual courage and suffering of those Johnny Rebs and Billy Yanks ultimately became one of the greatest gifts of mankind. And that great gift we call the United States. And I think the first word, united, is all important. It's a word we so often skip over, but it's at the very core of the country we are. Politicians talk a lot about democracy, but our republic would be vastly different if politicians grasped the necessity and the beauty and utilized the word union rather than waste so many days glued to other absolutely nearsighted objectives. I think the 535 members of that zoo in Washington need to remember that compromise made this nation. Compromise is all that holds it together. If we lose that compromise, this nation is doomed. It's just pure and simple. It's doomed. So I fear for our country. As a historian, I have real concern about where we are headed. History will always be the best teacher we can have. So it is fitting that we meet here at this time to reaffirm our faith in nationhood. Since bloody battle on these grounds, the journey to today has been long and hard. We owe it to those soldiers of the Civil War to keep pushing forward, to maintain devotion to basic American principles, to continue the dream of oneness for which men of blue and gray gave the last full measure of devotion. What they gave us was a new and hopefully lasting unity. For us to let that unity falter would be the grossest disservice we could pay the men of yesteryear who died for the future each of us enjoys. So let us look back with reverence at a nation making war that consumes 750,000 soldiers, 1.5 million horses, billions of dollars of material destruction, and incalculable personal hopes that were never fulfilled. That is but part of the cost for us being citizens of the greatest nation the world has ever known. The poet Kipling said it best, "Lord God of hosts, be with us yet, lest we forget, lest we forget." Thank you very much.